My life has been a wander in some sense. I don't think there's any very big jumps, nor do I have any sense of really managing my academic life. I manage it in the sense that I don't think anyone else has managed it. But if I look at the various places I've stopped along my life, and I spent some time at the University of Wisconsin, some time at Yale University, some time at Carnegie Institute of Technology, some time at the University of California at Irvine, and some time at Stanford. At each, and how did it happen that I went from one to the other? I don't think there's any kind of magic to that. I finished undergraduate school. I had to go to graduate school. Why did I go to Yale? Well, I went to Yale because, as I recall, Yale offered me $300 more than Harvard did, and $400 more than the University of Chicago did. So you go to Yale. Now, that sounds trivial, but I didn't have any real basis for choosing, so that's what you choose. Why did I go from Yale to Carnegie Tech? Because they offered me a job. And it was 1, 2, or 3 jobs that I was offered, but among those 2 or 3, it looked like a more interesting one. But it wasn't a fervent say, "Ooh, this is a great opportunity for me." It turned out to be wonderful, but it who knows? Why did I go to Irvine? Probably for almost partly personal reasons and partly just for the adventure. And why go to Stanford? Well, everybody goes to Stanford ultimately. So I've learned from each of those, but I don't have any sense that I manage them in order to learn from them. I think that I have wandered through life with a fair degree of irresponsible perversity, and it has served me well, but I wouldn't advertise it to anyone else as a way of life.
We're not saying take risk, change.
Sure, but that makes it sound much more significant than it is. It's a certain amount of indifference. It says, well, that sounds interesting. Let's do that. Or somebody says, I hear there's a show over here. Let's go see it. Okay.
Openness.
Well, it's probably openness. Maybe it's just foolishness. Maybe it's just some low-level stupidity. But some people talk these days about something called mindfulness, which I don't particularly think has too much content. But most of this is not mindful. I mean, it's just living, we spent a year in California while I was still at Carnegie Tech, and my wife said, we can go back to Pittsburgh, but we're going to live in California. So we did. Now, is that managing your academic career? Not particularly, but it seemed to work all right.
And what about your encounter with Europe and specifically Scandinavia? Was that the turning point, or again?
Oh, it was a very important turning point, but it was almost all chance. When I first went to Europe, I was disappointed in the following sense, that I was traveling in Germany particularly, and I wanted to talk to young researchers, but I couldn't because I was too distinguished. I had to talk to the heads of the institutes or the heads of the laboratories, who mostly didn't know what was going on. and they were not nearly as interesting as the young people, but I really couldn't manage to talk to them. So I wasn't sure I could solve that problem. For somewhat unique and not particularly profound reasons, Johan Olsen and Søren Christensen came to work with me one year. And we liked each other, and we started working, and that was pleasant. That was one fortuitous thing. If they hadn't come, I probably would not have. The second is a family thing, that I had resisted living overseas in order to be sure that our children had a stable family life and so on. I didn't want to uproot them, I thought. One day at the table, one of my sons said, "If you're so well known, why don't you ever get to go overseas? We want to live overseas." And so I just misjudged them. So then I said, okay, and the next opportunity was an opportunity to go to Norway and Denmark. And so we went, and that started a long, very fruitful link with Scandinavia. A link that certainly was furthered by the fact that I grew up in a part of the U.S. that is heavily Scandinavian. So the culture was basically the culture that I grew up in.
So you went back to
So I went back to my culture, basically. But all of these were fortuitous. You know, there wasn't a good reason for it, and yet it turned out to make a lot of difference.
So are you saying that the decision which brought you then to develop together with the Scandinavians the idea of the garbage can was a kind of garbage can decision itself?
It was indeed, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's, there's an old saying about marriage that most people spend too much time deciding to get married and not enough time making the marriage a good marriage after they've had it. That what makes a good life are not good decisions, but good elaborations, good implementation, good. It's a kind of la vita è bella again.
La vita è bella again. Yeah.
That almost anything can be a rewarding experience if you have that kind of attitude toward it. So you can even go to Italy and have a...
Jim, in this wandering around in life,
Mm-hmm.
did you have mentors who helped you in this wandering?
Well, many people helped me, but I'm not conscious of ever having a mentor. I'm not even sure that I believe that's a good thing. I think in the world in which I live, a serious scholar is neither a protégé nor a mentor. That those kinds of relationships, although they have many useful things about them, make it difficult to develop the tough independence that a good scholar has. So that now it may be a freak of my peculiar life that the places where, in times when I might have had a mentor, for extraneous reasons, I didn't. So when I was an undergraduate, I went to the University of Wisconsin. Basically, I was only there for 2 years. I was there for a year, went to the Army, came back, was there for a year, and then went off to graduate school. There was no time or inclination to develop close relations with any of my professors. I knew them, I liked them, but that was it. I went off to Yale, and the Yale faculty that I was in was engaged in a very bitter personal dispute. The senior faculty did not like each other, and they were fighting all the time, and the junior faculty were hiding so that they wouldn't get caught in the gunfire. So I thought that was perfect, because that meant that none of the faculty had time to interfere with my education. So I got myself educated, but I really didn't establish very close relations with any of those faculty. I went to the first job, which would be also a possibility, and I worked with Herb Simon, but that wasn't the kind of relationship we had. We had a much tougher relationship than that. And so I've never been conscious of that relationship. On my own part, I've resisted playing that role with students. I think they should be independent, and they should not model themselves after me. I have no notion that it makes any sense to model yourself after me. And so by and large, with most of my students, we spend a long time talking with each other. We try to develop some sort of shared ideas, but their work is their work, and they do not work on my problems, except accidentally.
How do you personally work on a paper?
Giuseppe, I might have been able to answer that question 40 or 50 years ago, but now it has become so sort of routine and automated, I'm not sure that I understand it, but if I step back and try to understand it, it's, I know some of the things. I'm always working on multiple papers. I'm not working on individual papers. I tend to engage in endless rewrites, as I rewrite a paper much more than I think most people do. Typically, I think papers start either with an idea or some empirical puzzle, and then you work out from those. But I don't know, I don't have any deep sense of a strategy or tactics or how this happens. I do have a fairly deep sense that, in a sense, I take responsibility for the paper, and I do not share responsibility for the paper.
What do you mean?
I mean that editors and referees are not joint authors. They are helpful colleagues sometimes, but the paper is mine. And the paper, I am the audience that it has to satisfy. Not an editor, not a reader, not an audience. I am the audience. And that is somewhat at variance with sort of contemporary ways of proceeding. I have tried to persuade journal editors not to use the revise and resubmit decision.
Really?
I think that's a bad policy, because that tempts the editor and the referees into thinking they are co-authors. I think the editor's job is to accept or reject. And if the writer wants to do something and send it back, that's fine. But providing detailed suggestions of how you change the paper confuses the issue. It makes you into a teacher rather than a editor, rather than a gatekeeper. And probably not a very good teacher either. And it leads to terrible consequences. I have colleagues and students who no longer work very hard on the papers before they submit them, because they figure, well, they'll get rejected or get revised and resubmit, and they'll have all these new additional comments. Why should they try to put the paper in final form before they solicit these comments? I think that's destructive of the whole system. So I think you write a paper, you take responsibility for the paper, and you listen to any comments and criticism that people may make, But whether you pay any attention to them is entirely up to you, and often you don't. So that's fairly important.
Mm-hmm. And how did you choose or were chosen by co-authors for your projects?
Well, projects is a kind of funny term, but because I don't think I've very often been on a project in a sense of a large-scale grant that has several functions and several parts, each of which has to fit together, and so I haven't worked on that kind of a project. If by project you mean the papers I wrote,
yeah.
Right? Well, if you look at my list of publications, you will find that I have collaborated with a lot of people. I counted not so long ago. I think that I have had 48 different collaborators on published papers or books. A majority of those collaborators were students. But the collaboration was always of a form, or I think probably always of a form, almost always of a form, that we were talking about ideas and then we started jointly trying to work with them. I think there's only one case in all those publications where I have co-authored a paper based on a dissertation. That's not the way I work with students. What happens is the students work with me for a while and we get interested in a problem and we then go off and do something on it. And quite often students will come to me and say, will you work with me on this paper? I almost always say no. Because the motivation is wrong. The reason most students come to me and ask me will I work on the paper, they believe that if I work on the paper, it's more likely to be published. And I doubt that's true, but even if it is true, if it is true, it's certainly the wrong motivation. So I try to discourage that kind of relationship. But if it grows out of a kind of collegial discussions and so on, then I find students some of the best colleagues I ever had. Mm-hmm. And now I've also written a lot of things with non-students or ex-students or colleagues. But for most of my life, my primary collegial group has been students. And some of the better known works that I've written are obviously written with collegial colleagues. I work with Johan Olsen, and I work with Herb Simon or with Richard Seyert. Those are colleagues, although Olsen was originally a student. So choosing or being chosen is I think that's a good word, but it's a little complicated process. Mm-hmm. I can give an example. Some years ago, I wrote a paper by myself, actually, which was published in Psychological Review, which showed that ordinary learning would produce risk aversion. And it was a theoretical paper. It was basically a simulation derivation of that proposition. A little later, I was working with a student named Jerker Denrell, now a colleague of mine, who was interested in that kind of problem. And I said, well, look, there is an unsolved version of this. Let's work on it a while. So we published a paper, and after we published that paper, I said that there's still an unsolved problem of this. We haven't got an analytic proof. So he then went off and developed an analytic proof. And it went from something that I was working on by myself to something I was working on with him to something he was working on by himself. And it was all a very continuous stream of ideas, and a very, I think, very fruitful stream of ideas, which he has developed now in several papers in very nice new directions. And so I think it's collaboration at its best for me.
So it seems that you are saying that co-authorship is a more a kind of a academic dialogue,
Yes.
an opportunity for academic dialogue on unsolved puzzles.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, sometimes it's a little different from that, but that's the best is that, and in some sense the papers are almost incidental to the dialogue, and that was true when back many years when I collaborated with Dick Seiert. We used to have lunch. We would bring our lunch and we would eat lunch together in a little corner of the building where no one could find us. It was behind the auditorium. So it was really a secret place. And we would eat lunch and talk about things. And out of that came our work. But it was, the whole spirit was, let's have lunch and talk. And that I think is the way scholarship should proceed.
So you confirm an Italian attitude to discuss in front of food.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are a few things I don't confirm. I don't drink cappuccino, and well, that's about it.
If you reflect about your experience, what could be the do's and don'ts